Well, today we're going to be finishing up this session that we actually started last week and didn't finish. We're not going through all the verses again, obviously, but I'm just reminding you of where we were in the section, presenting the great high priest as a suffering son. And I'll just read those first two verses. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered. So that was what we focused on last week, was that earthly experience that he had. Specifically, this is a reference to his agony in Gethsemane, in the garden, where he was, praying, Lord, please, could you take this cup from me? If there's any other way to do this. And we talked about how this was that the high priest calling out to the one who could deliver him from that. And we talked about how there seemed to be, in our minds anyway, the way we look at it, almost a contradiction, because it says that God heard his prayer, but yet he did still go to the cross. And we said, how can those two things be true? And if you remember, we went back and actually looked at the passage and remember that the prayer was really two things. It was, Lord, can you take this cup from me? But it was also, but not my will, but yours. And that was the part, obviously God responded to that part and his obedience to that. And that he actually learned obedience, as verse 8 tells us. And we talked about again, how could that possibly be? That to us, the idea of the Son of God learning anything, when you think about his omniscience and his omnipotence and all that, seems absurd. But last week we discussed reminding ourselves that during his time on earth, it wasn't taken away from him. He didn't lose anything of his nature, but he voluntarily set aside the use of some of his attributes so that he could experience human limitations. And he actually did have to learn some things. There were some things that while he was on earth, he admitted he did not know. And it wasn't because he was no longer omniscient, but again, remember, as Philippians tells us, he emptied himself of some of those attributes of Godhood. It did not change his nature, but it did change his experience on earth so that he could be our high priest, so that he could represent us, he could be one of us, so that he could really feel the temptation that we felt. And so he had to learn obedience because he had to have the opportunity to be disobedient. Because if he didn't have the capacity to be disobedient, he wouldn't understand what it means to be tempted in all the ways that we are. So he was tempted, yet without sin. But that doesn't mean he didn't really experience the temptation. He did. So he did have to, in some sense, learn obedience through his suffering. And in that way, he understands the reality of the temptations that we face, because he really has been there. It's not just a fiction to say he understands. It's not just a word, not just words. He really and truly does. So that's kind of a recap of the verses that lead up to today's verses, which is finishing this section, and that is verses 9 and 10. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So here we have a couple of points that we want to make in verse 9. The first phrase, being made perfect. And we've talked about this word before. It's a word that's used a lot of times in the New Testament, teleo, and it means to complete something. It means to fulfill something, to accomplish something. It's the same word that Jesus himself used on the cross when he says, it is finished. And that meant that it's a form of this word. And that meant that it was completed, that it was accomplished, that everything that needed to be done was done. So when you then see Jesus in this particular scenario that we're talking about, that he was made perfect through the suffering, that is the idea that it's not saying that he wasn't perfect before in the way that we think of perfection. You know, we use that word differently in our English language. We think of perfect as something that's good without flaw, you know, doesn't have anything wrong with it. And that was always the case with Jesus from the very beginning. He was always sinless. So that's not what it's meaning here in the sense of being made something that he wasn't already. It's perfection in the sense of accomplishing something, completing something, fulfilling something. And of course that's a reference to his mission, the reason that he came here. What did he always say when during his earthly life? He would say, you know, I came not to do my will but my Father's will. You know, and his Father's will was that he come in order to sacrifice himself, to be the Lamb of God that would be slaughtered for the sins of the world. That's what he came to do. So he was made perfect then. He faced this agonizing choice. As we talked about before, he had the capacity to say no, but he did not say no. He nonetheless obeyed his call. He obeyed his purpose. He completed the thing that he came to do. And that is so important when we think about, when you think about the word faith, for example. You know, it kind of means many things. You know, we think of faith, we think of it in terms of belief. And it does sort of mean that. It is a word for believing. But if you get to the root of what the word faith actually means, why do you believe somebody? If you say, okay, I believe you, why are you, if anybody tells you something and you say, I believe you, why is it that you believe them? And in general, it's because it's someone that you trust. The reason you believe what they say is because you trust them. And why do you trust them? Usually it's because they have proved themselves trustworthy. It usually means that when they've told you something, it was true. It usually means that when they said they were going to do something, they did it. So they are worthy of your trust. So when they tell you something, you believe them. So think about that when you think of the idea of faith and belief in Christ. We believe his words not just because he said them, it's because he's proved himself worthy of believing them. Because he did what he said he would do. The times that we fail to believe somebody is because they fall down on that. It's because they say, well, I'm going to do this, and then they don't do it. So the next time they say, oh, I'll do this for you, you don't believe them. They're not reliable, you know. You're not going to put, you know, you're not going to trust your life to them. Or you're not going to trust something very important to them. You know, you're not going to say, I'll let you watch my children, you know, because they're unreliable. You know, you only are willing to put something important to you on the line if they've proven themselves reliable. So that's the thing to remember here when we think about the work that Jesus did and the fact that he asks us to have faith in him. It does mean believe him, but it's not a blind belief. It's not a blind thing. You know, so often you hear that phrase used when it comes to religious belief, the idea of having blind faith. And it's not without biblical precedent, because I know later in Hebrews we talk about the definition of faith as believing in the evidence of things that are not seen. Certainly that's a part of it. But when we're talking about trusting Christ, it isn't really a blind faith. I mean, it may be blind in the sense we haven't physically in the flesh met him like we've met each other and like they did then. But when we look at the history of what he did, it isn't a blind faith, because he said, this is what I'm going to do, and he did it. And so that's the essence of this phrase that he was made perfect. It means he accomplished what he set out to do, which means what? That he kept his promise. Which means that what he said he was going to do all during his earthly ministry, he fulfilled. So therefore, he is worthy of our trust, worthy of our faith, worthy of our belief, because he didn't lie to us and he didn't fail us. So he is once made perfect. As a result of that, he became the source of eternal salvation. It's also translated in some, I think the King James Version translation is this way, as the author of eternal salvation. Now, to translate it as the word as source is not incorrect, but when I hear the word source, that almost seems passive, like the idea of the source of a river. It's just water coming down, off of a mountain. It seems very sort of passive. But the word there actually is an active verb. And literally it means to be a causer. So, huh?
What?
A causer. Someone who causes something.
Oh, causes.
Causes something to happen. In other words, and this is why I think the King James Version translated as author of salvation. Because you think about what an author does when they write, they create, whatever that work is, a story or whatever. They are causing something to be that didn't exist before. You think of any creative endeavor, painting a painting or whatever it is, you are making something to exist that did not exist before. You're causing something to be. It's a creative act. Authorship and artistry is a creative act. That's the idea here when it says he's the source of salvation. It doesn't mean just that it flows from him, though it does, but it's not a passive thing. It's an active thing. It's a creative thing. He made salvation to exist. Okay? And it was his being made perfect, that is the completion, the fulfillment of his purpose, that created, that caused salvation. And it's important to see the linkage of those two. Because again, what made salvation possible for you and I? What made salvation possible for you and I is that innocent blood was shed, that was accepted as the atonement for our sins. Someone else died in our place. Someone else shed their blood for us. Someone else served our sentence for us. Someone else took our punishment for us. Okay? That wouldn't have happened if he hadn't have completed or accomplished his purpose. So those two ideas cannot exist apart from each other. His work of accomplishing the mission created our opportunity for redemption, created our salvation. And that's why, again, I think using the word authorship is really a good, it's not really, I don't think, a literal translation, but it's a good metaphor to describe that creative act, to make something happen that didn't exist before. And so his obedience then to doing this created that possibility of deliverance. And what it is that he created, eternal salvation, or salvation eternal as it's actually in the Greek text. And we've talked about that word before, aionios, which is where we get the English word eon from. And it basically means something that's ageless, perpetual, that has no limitations at all of time. And so he's going to go, the author of Hebrews is going to go into this in more detail in chapter 7, but he begins to lay the framework here. And it's this contrast between the work of the earthly high priest that was of the order of Aaron in the Old Testament, which he came and, Aaron and all the other Levitical priests that came after him, when they did their high priestly work in the tabernacle and later the temple. And we've mentioned this before, but it's important for us to point it out here. What was the nature of that work? Or maybe not the nature of that work, but what was the character of that work? And that is that they had to keep doing it over and over and over and over again. They had to go back on the Day of Atonement. Every year they had to go back and do it again and do it again and do it again. The work that the earthly high priest did was not ageless. It was not eternal. It was limited in time. In fact, you could even say it was really only symbolic of something. It in itself did not absolve sins. It was really, looking back on it, it was only the Israelites' adherence to that ceremony that expressed their version of faith in what God had told them to do. It was really their faith and belief in that ritual that was the actual atonement. Because the actual blood of bulls and goats, as he will again mention later, really couldn't do anything. And in fact, the high priest himself couldn't do anything, because what did he have to do? Himself? Remember, the earthly high priest, he had to offer sacrifices for his own sins before he could do the work for the people, because he had his own sins to deal with. So there were all of these limitations to the earthly priest's work. But that is not the case with Christ as our great high priest, because what he caused, what he created, what he authored was eternal salvation. What he did, he only had to do once. And again, we'll come back to this in chapter 7, but he's laying the framework here that the atonement that the great high priest obtained for us was not limited to only a year, like the priestly work of the Aaronic priesthood. Aaronic priesthood, got to say it right. But it had an endless eternal effect. In other words, this salvation was eternal. So, once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Now, I want to talk for a moment about that word obey, and we've talked about this for years because, in Grace Fellowship Church, the whole reason that, we named the church Grace Fellowship Church was because our teaching has always focused on the grace of God, and that salvation is by grace through faith and not by works. So whenever we see in the New Testament especially a reference to obedience, we always have to look at that in the framework of what that means in terms of grace, because it isn't obedience in the sense of obeying laws and saying, okay, you have to obey these laws, and if you disobey these laws, then then you can't experience salvation. That would be foreign to the New Testament, even foreign to this passage, because clearly the book of Hebrews is presenting this salvation that he authored as an act of faith and belief. So when he's talking about obedience here, what does he mean? Well, remember what the word obey in the Greek, it's translated obey in the Greek, means. We've talked about it before because it's been mentioned earlier in this passage. It means to listen attentively to something, to heed it. So it can mean obey in the sense of obeying an order, but it has a broader meaning to that. It's the idea of hearing something and responding to it. Okay? So if you remember way back in chapter 3 and 4 that we spent so much time on, what was the author telling us about? The references that he was making from the Old Testament, from the Psalms and from Numbers. Remember, he was talking about God's voice speaking to us, and us not hardening our hearts to the voice of God, but instead listening to the voice of God. And so when it says for all who obey him, I think he's clearly reiterating here this admonishment from chapters 3 and 4, that we have heard the voice of God calling to us. And the call for us is not to harden our hearts to it like those Jews did in the wilderness that we talked about, seemed like for a month. Not to harden our hearts, but to make the choice to follow God. And so in this context, obedience is not just slavishly obeying a law for the sake of the law. It is listening to the voice of God and responding to it. And the way that he called them to respond was to say yes and follow him into the promised land that he called them to. And that's the context here of those who obey him. Those who listen attentively to the voice of God, respond in faith to it, then that salvation which the great high priest has created or caused can be applied to us. Were you about to say something? You look like you have something at the tip of your tongue.
No, that's...
Okay. I just didn't want to jump ahead to the next verse if you had a comment there. Okay. And then that leads us to... Is he going to go? Oh, here we go again. Well, I'm going to go, even though that didn't change, I'm going to go on. Verse 10. He was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And that phrase, designated, when he says designated by God, that means to be called in a public or official way. In fact, where you see this is the root of that word translated designated refers to a town square. And so the picture there is like in front of the people, you know, in the town square, in front of the population. It is a very public appointment. It's kind of like the king or whoever in front of everybody saying, I appoint him, so that you all see that I've appointed him, that you all see that he has my authority, that you all see that I've given him a job to do, and that you know that that authority comes from me. Okay? So that's the idea, that he was designated or appointed by God. And this, again, reiterates what he earlier said back in verse 5, when he said, well, really back to verse 4, no one takes this honor, being a high priest, no one takes this honor upon himself, he must be called by God, just as Aaron was. So Christ also did not take upon himself the glory of a high priest, but God said to him, and so God called to him, God appointed him, but he did so publicly in front of all of us, that we may see that he was called by God to take on this work, to take on this office of the great high priest. It was an official appointment for service that God gave him the authority and the power to do. And the fact that Aaron and the other Levitical priests that followed him, they didn't choose that work either. It wasn't Aaron's idea to be the high priest of God. God said, take Aaron and you're going to make him a high priest. The reason that God did that was to make it clear that the priesthood was not something that we decide to do and take upon ourselves. That is a very specific, holy and sacred role that only God has the power and authority to choose who's going to represent him to us and us to him. And so God calling Aaron was then a picture of the fact that when Christ came along, God would call him to be our great high priest. And so he was designated by God to be high priest. So this earthly experience that Jesus went through, the agony and the suffering, this was the work of the great high priest. And I think this is so important when you think about the humility that Jesus expressed and experienced. Later on, not so much in the days of Aaron, maybe a little bit, but certainly by the New Testament days, when you think about the earthly Levitical priesthood, how the high priests were perceived by the people, and how their own self-perception was, what they thought of themselves when they're the high priest. And that was a position of importance, power, and prestige, and privilege. The high priest, in the earthly sense, became an office that was lifted up as position of honor and importance and influence. And if you were the high priest, you were something else. You had a lot of power and you had a lot of influence. And by the first century days, they were probably fairly wealthy too. And Jesus, through his work, reminded us that the work of the high priest was not to bring honor upon himself, was not to lift himself up. The work of the high priest, the great high priest, was to die, to be humiliated, to become the sins of the world, to actually become what God hates, and that is sin. That he might stand in our place and take, our punishment for us. It was not a position of great glory for Jesus. He suffered. He went through anguish. He experienced the judgment of God in our place, that instead we might know deliverance. And once again, here we have this mention again, to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So for the second time, he's mentioned Melchizedek. And again, like I mentioned in the previous week when Melchizedek's name's mentioned, we're not going to go into a lot of detail about him now, because chapter 7 goes into much more detail about who Melchizedek was and how it relates to Jesus. So we'll dive into this figure of history later. But for now, what we want to see in this is that this unique priestly order is different from Aaron's and the Levitical earthly human priestly order. He's not saying that he's a great high priest after the order of Aaron or of the Levitical priesthood. It's a different kind of priesthood, one that is after the order of Melchizedek. And again, we'll talk more detail about he's kind of a mysterious figure. We're not told a lot about him in the scripture. But what we are told about him implies one of two things. One, that he was a type of Christ in the Old Testament, that he was used by God to be essentially a metaphor for what Christ would be as the great high priest. Or many believe that he actually was a pre-incarnate form of Christ himself. No one can really know for sure. Both ideas have a lot of adherence to it. But what is essential to understand about him is that he was presented in the book of Genesis as a priest and a king. He was simultaneously both. And that's unique from the priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, from the order of Aaron, who was only had priestly work, but was not royal in any way. Melchizedek was a priest and a king. So, he's an interesting topic, and we'll get more into him in chapter 7. But that's where we're going to leave off today. When we finish chapter 5 next week, starting in verse 11, this is going to be a change in focus. It's kind of a big parenthesis, because the author of Hebrews is going to stop talking about the priesthood, which he'll come back to, but he's going to stop talking about the priesthood, and he's going to focus now on the level of spiritual maturity of his readers. I think it's interesting that he just stops in the middle of this talk about the priesthood, and it's like he has this realization that perhaps they're not spiritually mature enough to understand much of what he's telling them. So he has to stop for a moment and deal with their spiritual maturity before he feels he can go on and talk more about the great high priest, and certainly Melchizedek, and then ultimately about issues of what faith is. And so this section is itself, particularly chapter 6, parts of chapter 6 have been in the past difficult to understand and even controversial. So like I have said always, whenever we come to difficult passages, we always have to not lift them out in isolation and out of context. We have to see them in the context of the whole book of Hebrews and the entire message that the author of Hebrews is trying to give us, so that we don't get an out of balance interpretation of these difficult to understand passages. Because it's easy to misinterpret them into saying, in many cases, the opposite of what they really mean. So you can't lift them out. You should never do it anyway, but some passages are much more dangerous to lift out of context than others. Chapter 6 is one such chapter. So keep that in mind as we approach it. So, any comments or questions about today?
You keep teasing us with Melchizedek.
I know, but that's because he keeps teasing us with Melchizedek. But it's in chapter 7 that he really goes into detail about it. And so he's teasing us about it. So I'm teasing you because Paul or whoever it is teasing us. But I think the reason that he's teasing is not just to be teasing, but because it is an important but a challenging subject, and he has to lay the framework so that we properly understand what he says when he gets to it.
Yeah.
So that we don't misinterpret or miss his point.
Makes sense.
And so he's building up gradually so that he doesn't just hit us with it all at once, out of the blue. He's got us thinking about Melchizedek, see? And so it's in the back of our minds as he's going through these other things. What is this about Melchizedek? What is this about me and you, we all know he's coming in chapter 7. But if you're the first century reader and you haven't read it, you're like, why does he keep talking about it? Let me go back and look at it. What is he talking about, Melchizedek? I hadn't thought about him in years, And so he's putting this in the back of our minds and making the reader think about it and ponder on what he means by that. And then, bam, he hits you with it. And then hopefully then, it comes home and makes sense to us.
You were talking about Jesus is the perfect high priest, mega high priest. And Jesus knew the perfect time for when he needed to sacrifice himself,
Yes.
to become the sin of everyone in the world.
Yes.
I mean, because there's so many places in the Bible where it says, it's not my time.
It's not my time. You're right. He did say that several times.
And he knew what time. I mean, he knew the perfect time.
Yeah, and that's hard for us to understand, okay, why that week and not the week after, why that year and not a year later. That's not something that we can even know, but you're right, it did matter.
And that's why we're waiting for the second coming. It's not the perfect time yet.
We might think
He
it
knows.
is.
Yes.
We may be saying, when, why not, but like you said, you're right, it's like, no matter what it may, how we may perceive it, there is a particular time that is the right time. And in retrospect, maybe we'll be able to see that it was the perfect time, but right now, we're like, oh.
Seems like a good time now, but,
But you're right. That is an important thing to remember, not just that he did it, but the timing was obviously mattered.
mhm.
The sooner the better.
Huh?
She said the sooner the better.
Yeah,
We're always in a hurry though, aren't we?
yeah.
But
But I hate to quote that, I won't say the name since I'm on video, but that previous pastor of ours, but he did say one thing that was true. We can't say it's closer now than it's ever been before. We can at least say that much.
Yes.
But God just keeps extending that grace and mercy, just giving people another chance.
And
because the proper amount of people.
extending our faith as well too.
Yes.
I've said before, faith is a spiritual muscle and it has to be stretched sometimes in fact, anyone who knows anything about weightlifting knows that what makes a muscle grow is that you're actually ripping the fibers apart when you put strain on it at a certain level. That's why it hurts.
Yeah.
But when it grows back bigger. And so you know, faith is a spiritual muscle, and sometimes you gotta stretch it in order for it to grow and get stronger. And sometimes that hurts.
That's the reason when you
Sometimes
weight lift, you have to weight lift every other day, because you gotta give it a day to heal that ripping.
It's funny you say that, because I think sometimes God gives us a day off from the string, from ripping our faith too, you know? I think sometimes we do have days where He gives us a break to take a breath, you know? But it's always because there's another challenge coming. So, that's why I always said you've either just come out of a storm, you're in a storm, or you're waiting for the next storm.
Yeah. Okay, I've just made it through this storm now, and wait for the next one.
Well, that is encouraging when you realize that you're not in the storm alone.
That's right.
That's true.
He's right there with you. He's waiting for you in the storm.
In the eye of the storm.
And that's how we grow.
And that's how we grow. Exactly. So that's part of faith, is accepting the reality of that in this world, there are storms.
Yep.
And all things work together for good for those who love the Lord. Because He uses the storms to strengthen that faith muscle.
Yeah.
There are things that, I think all of us can say this, there are things that we face and gotten through now that 20 years ago would have destroyed us.
Yeah.
Sure.
In my case, I can definitely say that.
He knows when.
You know, I couldn't handle some of the things I've been through recently. If I was in my 20s, it would have just
Yeah.
destroyed me in every way.
Yeah.
Destroyed my faith.
Yeah.
But it's hard to see in the middle of it. It's hard to see. But sometimes you have to look back with perspective to see it.
I'll remember that God sees eternity at a glance.
Eternity at a glance.
That stuck with me. I think it'll stick with me forever,
I guess
because I associate
to your
so
mind,
much
the
with
way you are with
the
a
calendar. Yeah, I'm such a calendar person. Eternity at a glance.
But he can
Yes.
see the past.
and remember,
With that-
talking about the-
eternity. Yeah.
and remember talking about the second coming. That date's already there. He's already put the Outlook invite there.
Yeah.
We have no idea when it is. We've already accepted it and
Yeah.
said yes.
Yes, I'll be there whenever.
I'll be there, but we don't know where it is on the
Rearrange
calendar.
my schedule.
There's no conflict there on your schedule. So He knows it's already there. Just wait. We just don't know where that is.